Daniel's peaceful drive home shattered when flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any laws. So why was his heart racing with fear as he pulled over? What was about to happen would change his life forever. It was supposed to be just another day, a typical afternoon drive, the sun casting a golden glow across the quiet streets. Daniel, a man who had worked hard to build a life of peace and accomplishment, was driving home from work. His thoughts were on the upcoming weekend, a barbecue with his family, laughter with his friends, a moment of calm after a long week. But in an instant, that calm was shattered. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air. Sirens. Blue and red lights flashed behind him. Confused, Daniel glanced in his rearview mirror. His heart raced as he saw a police car right behind him, demanding he pull over. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. Nothing about his drive home was out of the ordinary. So why? Why was this happening? As he pulled over to the side of the road, Daniel's mind whirred with questions. Maybe there was some kind of mistake, a routine check. He had always been respectful of the law. But something inside him, something deep, born from years of experience as a black man in America, knew this wasn't just a mistake. He felt a chill creep down his spine. This wasn't going to be just a simple traffic stop. He rolled down his window, hands steady on the wheel, breathing slow and deliberate. He had seen this before, seen it too many times in the news. Men who looked like him, being pulled over for no reason. Men who had done nothing wrong, yet somehow found themselves on the ground, in handcuffs. He had always hoped it would never happen to him, but now it was happening. Daniel's mind raced back to the countless stories he had seen on the news. Stories of innocent black men who were pulled over for minor infractions, or worse, for no reason at all. Some were roughed up, others never made it home. He had always believed if you followed the law, if you showed respect, you'd be safe. But now in this moment, his belief was crumbling. The officer, stiff and cold, walked up to the window. He didn't smile, didn't offer a polite greeting like Daniel had seen in movies or in interactions with his white friends. Instead, the officer's face was a mask of suspicion. License and registration. His voice was mechanical, devoid of warmth or acknowledgement. It wasn't a conversation, it was a demand. Daniel complied immediately. His hands, visibly trembling now, reached for his wallet. Every move was calculated, careful not to provoke any reaction from the officer. Every moment felt heavy with tension, every breath thick with anxiety. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, but Daniel could hear it in his tone. He wasn't really asking. It was more of a statement, a power play, a reminder of who held authority in this situation. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding, and I didn't run any lights. I'm just on my way home." Daniel's voice was calm, though inside a storm of emotions brewed. He had done nothing wrong. He had a clean record, no reason to be in trouble. And yet here he was, feeling guilty for simply existing in the wrong skin. The officer didn't seem convinced. He took Daniel's documents without another word and walked back to his patrol car. The minutes stretched into eternity. The world outside felt distant, as if time itself had slowed down, trapping Daniel in this moment of uncertainty. Inside the patrol car, the officer glanced over Daniel's details. But even though everything checked out, valid license, clean record, something in the officer's demeanor shifted. A hard, almost suspicious edge lingered in his eyes, as if the facts in front of him didn't align with the assumptions already formed in his mind. And that's when the real nightmare began. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Why were there more officers? Why were they treating him like a criminal when all he had done was comply? He hadn't resisted. He hadn't been disrespectful. He had followed every instruction, just like he'd been taught since he was a child. Be polite, be obedient, don't make waves. But now it seemed none of that mattered. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. A second officer approached. This one had a hand on his belt, his other hand resting on his gun holster. Daniel's mind raced with fear. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything could go horribly wrong? "Step out of the car." The officer's voice was no longer just mechanical. It was commanding, cold, and filled with authority. Daniel blinked, disbelief flickering across his face. "What? Why?" His voice trembled, not with fear, but with sheer confusion. None of this made sense. He hadn't broken any laws. He hadn't done anything wrong. "Step out of the car, now!" This time it wasn't a request. It was an order. The second officer's fingers grazed the butt of his gun, and Daniel's heart dropped. This could go bad, very bad. But what choice did he have? He didn't want to be another headline, another statistic in the growing list of unjust arrests, or worse. With slow, deliberate movements, Daniel reached for the door handle and opened it. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of all the eyes on him. The police, the bystanders, the eyes of suspicion, judgment, and fear. He stood there, hands slightly raised, exposed to the world, vulnerable. Daniel stood outside of his car, the world moving in slow motion around him. The officers, now swarming like bees around their hive, muttered orders and instructions. Their radios crackled with static, filling the air with a noise that only added to the surreal nature of the moment. He felt the eyes of everyone on him, neighbors watching from behind curtains, drivers slowing their cars as they passed by. A sickening knot tightened in his stomach. This was not just an arrest, this was a public spectacle. The officer in charge, his face expressionless, took a step closer. "Turn around," he ordered, voice clipped and cold. Daniel hesitated for a second, just a second, but it was long enough for the tension to spike. He could feel every fiber of his body resisting this moment. What was happening? What was the reason for this? But before he could even ask, the officer's voice cut through the air again, this time louder, more aggressive. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Daniel's heart raced, his body trembling with both fear and disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. His question was not one of defiance, but of genuine confusion. He had done everything they asked. He had complied without resistance. How had it escalated to this? But there was no answer. Only the cold touch of metal cuffs as they clamped around his wrists. The sound of the handcuffs locking felt like a hammer striking an anvil, each click echoing in his mind, solidifying the reality of the situation. He was being arrested for no reason in front of everyone. His mind raced, scrambling for some sense of logic in this situation. What had he done wrong? What could he have done differently? But in the pit of his stomach, he knew. He knew this wasn't about what he had done or hadn't done. It was about what he looked like, the color of his skin, the assumptions they had made the moment they saw him. And that realization, it hurt more than the cuffs digging into his wrists. As they led him to the police cruiser, Daniel felt the weight of humiliation settle over him. The world outside the car seemed to blur as they shoved him into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a harsh finality. It was happening. He was going to jail. For what? He didn't know. No one had told him. No one had offered any explanation. It was as if his very existence was enough to justify his arrest. Inside the cruiser, the air was stifling, thick with the suffocating smell of plastic and sweat. His hands, bound behind his back, began to ache from the pressure of the cuffs. He tried to shift, to find a more comfortable position, but there was none to be found. His thoughts spiraled, bouncing between disbelief and anger, fear and frustration. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind. Faces flashed before his eyes. His wife, his 2 children, his mother. What would they think? How would he explain this? Would they even believe him? Or would they see him the way the officers did? A criminal, guilty without cause. The thought crushed him. His family had always seen him as strong, dependable, a man who had made something of himself. But now, he felt stripped, exposed, reduced to nothing more than a suspect. The drive to the station felt endless. Each bump in the road jolted him, not just physically but emotionally. The weight of injustice pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. How had it come to this? How had his life, a life he had carefully built, full of hard work and integrity, been reduced to this moment? He looked out the window as they passed the same streets he drove every day, familiar places that suddenly felt hostile, alien. The neighborhood bakery where he'd often pick up treats for his kids, the park where he played with them on weekends. All of it now felt tainted by this experience. Could he ever drive these streets again without remembering this moment? When they arrived at the station, the humiliation continued. The officers, still cold and detached, escorted him inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over everything. The air smelled of bleach and despair, the sounds of distant voices and clanging metal creating an oppressive atmosphere. They led him to the booking area, where another officer, equally as indifferent, processed him. His fingerprints were taken, his photographs snapped without warning. He stood still, staring at the camera, the flash temporarily blinding him. In that moment, he felt like an object, a thing to be cataloged and stored away. "Empty your pockets," one officer barked, pulling Daniel from his thoughts. He complied, handing over his wallet, his keys, his phone. It was all part of the routine, but to Daniel, it felt like they were stripping away the last pieces of his dignity. Everything he carried with him, his identity, his connection to the world outside, was taken away in those moments. The cell was small, barely enough room to sit down. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless gray, and the air inside was damp and cold. A single bench lined the wall, and Daniel sat down, his body heavy with the weight of what had just happened. His wrists were still cuffed, the metal biting into his skin. He stared at the floor, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. He was in jail, for nothing, for being black, for driving home after a long day, for existing. The anger began to build inside him, rising like a tidal wave. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. But what could he do? What could he say? He was one man against a system that had been designed to see him as less than. His thoughts turned to his family again. Would they come for him? Did they even know where he was? His wife, Lisa, would be frantic, wondering why he hadn't come home. His children would ask questions, their innocent faces full of confusion and fear. And how could he explain this to them? How could he tell them that their father, a man they looked up to, had been reduced to this? A mugshot, a set of fingerprints, a prisoner? As Daniel sat in the cold, empty cell, the enormity of the situation crushed him. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for his dignity, for his identity, for his very humanity. And in that moment, he realized something he had always known deep down. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who had been in his position, every black person who had faced the crushing weight of prejudice, of injustice, of being seen as guilty before they even opened their mouths. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, pulling Daniel from his thoughts. An officer appeared at the door, unlocking it with a loud clang. Daniel's heart raced again. Was this it? Were they going to let him go? Was this nightmare finally over? But the officer's expression told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer stepped into the cell. "You've got one phone call," he said flatly, without any emotion. Daniel nodded, his throat tight, his mind racing. Who should he call? His wife? His lawyer? His mother? His heart ached at the thought of hearing Lisa's voice, her panic, her confusion. How could he explain this to her when he couldn't even explain it to himself? They led him to the phone, and he dialed the number with shaking hands. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then finally a voice answered. "Hello?" It was Lisa. Her voice, though steady, had a quiver beneath the surface. She knew something was wrong. Daniel could feel the lump in his throat, a knot of shame and despair, but he swallowed hard and spoke. "Lisa, I'm at the police station." A long pause. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then finally her voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Why?" Daniel closed his eyes, tears threatening to spill. "I don't know." The holding cell was a small, suffocating room, its gray concrete walls trapping Daniel in a world that felt completely disconnected from everything he had known just hours earlier. The cold metal bench beneath him seemed to sap the warmth from his body, and the faint smell of bleach, mixed with something sour, lingered in the air. The heavy iron bars that separated him from the world outside rattled slightly as he sat there, waiting. Waiting for what, he didn't even know. The hours stretched out endlessly. Time seemed to lose meaning in this place, and with every passing minute, Daniel felt the weight of his situation bearing down on him. He had never been in jail before, never even come close. His whole life had been about staying on the right path, working hard and being a good man, a good father, a good husband, a good person. But none of that seemed to matter now. Here in this place, he was just another prisoner, just another black man in handcuffs. The echoes of distant voices and clanging doors drifted down the long hallway, but in his cell, there was only silence. Silence and his thoughts, which had become his worst enemy. How had this happened? The question played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had followed every rule, complied with every order. So why was he sitting here, in a cold, empty cell, feeling like a criminal? His mind raced through the events of the last few hours, searching for some kind of explanation, but there was none to be found. He felt helpless, lost in a system that didn't care about his innocence, only about appearances and assumptions. The longer Daniel sat there, the angrier he became. His whole life, he had worked hard to avoid situations like this. His mother had drilled it into him from a young age. Don't give them a reason, Daniel. Don't give them an excuse to treat you differently because they will. And he hadn't. He had followed all the rules. He had been respectful, compliant. And yet here he was, behind bars, his wrists still sore from the cuffs that had bound him like some kind of dangerous criminal. The anger surged through him, hot and burning, but underneath it all was something else, something darker. Fear. He had never felt this kind of fear before. It wasn't the fear of getting hurt physically. No, this was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of being powerless, of knowing that no matter how hard you fought, no matter how much you screamed, no one would hear you. It was the fear of being swallowed whole by a system that had been designed to forget people like him. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Daniel, you have to be extra careful out there. The world doesn't see you the same way it sees others. You're a black boy in America, and that means you have to walk a little straighter, talk a little softer. Don't give them a reason. He had always known what she meant, even if he hadn't fully understood it back then. And now, sitting in this cell, he realized just how true her words had been. A wave of guilt washed over him. He thought of his mother, of all the sacrifices she had made to raise him right, to keep him safe. And now, here he was, sitting in jail. What would she think of him now? He imagined her disappointment, her worry, and it broke something inside of him. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let himself fall apart. Not now. Not in here. If there was one thing his mother had taught him, it was how to survive. And that's what he needed to do now. Survive. He needed to keep his head clear, his emotions in check. But it was hard. So hard. The walls of the cell felt like they were closing in on him, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He had never felt so alone in his life. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The waiting was the worst part. Not knowing what would happen next. Not knowing if anyone even knew he was there. Had Lisa been able to contact a lawyer? Did she know what was going on? The thought of her sitting at home, scared and confused, made his chest tighten. He hated that he had put her through this. But what choice had he had? He remembered their wedding day, the way Lisa had looked as she walked down the aisle, the way his heart had felt like it might burst with happiness. He had promised her that day that he would always protect her, always keep her safe. But now he was the one who needed protection, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. Time moved slowly in the holding cell. Each passing minute felt like a reminder of his powerlessness. Occasionally, a guard would walk by, giving him a brief glance before continuing down the hall, as if he were invisible. The sound of footsteps echoed, then faded, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. Daniel's mind wandered back to the officers who had arrested him. He tried to recall their faces, their voices. Did they feel anything as they cuffed him and pushed him into the back of the car? Did they care? Or was he just another body in the system, another number to process, another file to close? The thought of it made him sick. He had always tried to see the good in people, but today he had seen something different. He had seen the coldness in their eyes, the way they looked right through him as if he didn't matter, and it terrified him. Eventually, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by the metallic jingle of keys. Daniel opened his eyes as a guard appeared in front of his cell. The man's face was blank, his expression unreadable. "You've got a visitor," the guard said flatly, unlocking the cell door with a quick twist of the key. A visitor? Daniel's heart leaped. Was it Lisa? Had she found a lawyer? Maybe this was the end of it. Maybe they were going to let him go. The guard gestured for him to follow, and Daniel stood, his legs shaky from hours of sitting in the same position. He followed the guard down the long, dimly lit corridor, his thoughts racing. The guard opened the door, and Daniel stepped inside the visitation room. His eyes scanned the small space, and there, on the other side of the glass, was Lisa. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She looked as lost as he felt. Daniel sat down slowly, picking up the phone on his side of the glass. Lisa did the same. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other, the weight of everything hanging in the air between them. Finally, Lisa broke the silence. "What happened, Daniel?" Her voice was small, fragile, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly would break something irreparable. Daniel shook his head, his throat tight. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know." Lisa's hand trembled as it rested on the phone. Daniel could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had gripped him since the moment the officers pulled him over. But beneath that fear, there was something else, a flicker of determination. She wasn't going to let him go through this alone. "We're going to fix this," she said, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "I've already called a lawyer. He's working on it. You're going to come home." Daniel wanted to believe her, but the weight of his situation made it hard. He could see it in Lisa's eyes, the uncertainty. They both knew the system wasn't always fair. But in that moment, hearing her voice, feeling her determination, he allowed himself a small sliver of hope. Back at the station, as Daniel sat in the cold cell, the officers gathered around their desks, glancing occasionally at the paperwork in front of them. They weren't in any hurry to process him. For them, it was just another routine arrest, just another name to add to the long list of faces they saw every day. But something about this arrest lingered in the air, an unspoken tension that no one acknowledged. Officer Matthews, the senior officer on duty, sat behind his desk, thumbing through Daniel's file. It was supposed to be a routine check, just another background check to ensure they had everything in order before processing him further. He ran Daniel's name through the system, fully expecting to find something, a minor infraction, an unpaid ticket, anything that would justify their actions. But as the screen loaded, his face hardened. The database revealed nothing. No criminal record, no history of violence, not even a traffic violation. Daniel's record was spotless. Matthews furrowed his brow, feeling a pang of unease. That wasn't what he had expected. He leaned back in his chair, glancing at his colleagues, who were busy chatting among themselves. "Hey," Matthews called out, his voice uncertain. "You guys know who this guy is?" The room went quiet. Officer Reed, who had been the first to confront Daniel at the traffic stop, glanced up. His expression was one of mild irritation. "What do you mean?" "He's just another guy we pulled over. Nothing special." Matthews shook his head, turning the screen so that Reed could see. "No, I mean, do you know who this guy actually is?" Reed walked over, the other officers trailing behind him. Curiosity piqued. They crowded around the desk, eyes scanning the information on the screen. And then, as they read the details, the air in the room shifted. Silence. The kind of silence that only comes when something significant, something unexpected, is uncovered. There on the screen was Daniel's name. His full name, Daniel Hargrove. Not just a regular man, not just another name in the system. Daniel Hargrove, the CEO of a highly successful tech company, a philanthropist who had donated millions to various causes, including social justice reform and youth education programs. A man with connections in high places, politicians, activists, and even celebrities. His name carried weight, not just in his local community, but across the country. Officer Reed's face paled as he read through the details. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. "No way. This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. But it was. There was no mistake. The room was thick with tension now. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado fading as they realized the gravity of what they had done. This wasn't just some random guy. This was a man who could make headlines. This was a man whose wrongful arrest could ignite a firestorm. Matthew stood up from his desk, running a hand through his hair. He was the senior officer here, and now the weight of the situation was crashing down on him. If this got out, and it would, there would be consequences, serious consequences, not just for him, but for the entire department. The media would have a field day, social media would explode, and worst of all, Daniel had the resources, the connections, to hold them all accountable. "Reed," Matthews said, his voice low and urgent, "you need to go talk to him. We need to get ahead of this before it blows up in our faces." Reed hesitated, glancing nervously at the other officers. None of them seemed eager to take responsibility for what had happened. They had all assumed Daniel was just another black man who had stepped out of line, someone they could easily push through the system. But now the weight of their assumptions hung heavy in the air. As Reed approached the cell, his footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had made a mistake that could cost him his career, his reputation, everything. He reached the door to the cell and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. How was he supposed to explain this? How could he possibly justify what had happened? Finally, with a deep breath, Reed unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. Daniel was sitting on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two men on opposite sides of a deeply flawed system. "Mr. Hargrove," Reed began, his voice tight with tension, We need to talk." Daniel didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Reed, his expression calm but filled with a quiet intensity. He had known all along that this was a mistake. He had known from the moment the handcuffs had been slapped on his wrists that none of this was justified. But now, sitting in this cell, he could see the fear in Reed's eyes, the fear of a man who had realized too late that he had crossed a line. Reed shifted uncomfortably, his heart pounding in his chest. We didn't know who you were. We made a mistake," he stammered. I'm sorry." But the words felt hollow, even as they left his mouth. What did it matter if they didn't know who Daniel was? What did it matter if he was a CEO or a philanthropist? They had judged him based on one thing and one thing alone, his skin color. And that was the real crime here. Daniel remained silent, his gaze never wavering. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, the weight of every injustice he had faced throughout his life. This was just the latest in a long line of moments where he had been reduced to a stereotype, a set of assumptions. But now the tables had turned. Now they were the ones scrambling for explanations, for apologies. Reed shifted on his feet, uncomfortable with the silence. "We're going to let you go," he said quickly, as if trying to make it all disappear. "No charges, nothing. You're free to go." But Daniel didn't move. He just continued to stare, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cell door swung open, and Officer Reed stepped back, gesturing for Daniel to leave. "You're free to go," he repeated, his voice tight, filled with an uneasy mixture of guilt and fear. The other officers stood in the hallway, their eyes fixed on Daniel, no longer with suspicion, but with an unspoken realization of the mistake they had made. But Daniel didn't move immediately. He stood up slowly, his body heavy with the exhaustion of what he had just endured. His wrists still ached from the cuffs and his heart still pounded in his chest. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was anger, a deep, burning anger that he had carried with him his whole life. An anger that, in this moment, had finally found its target. As he stepped into the hallway, the officers parted to make room for him, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. They had no idea what to say. What could they say? The man they had treated like a criminal was someone who could bring their entire careers crashing down with one phone call. But that wasn't what this was about for Daniel. It wasn't about power or reputation or even revenge. It was about respect, and that's what had been stripped from him today. His dignity, his humanity, reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in their eyes. Daniel stopped in front of Officer Reed, who looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The silence between them was heavy, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "I'm sorry," Reed mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with the weight of the injustice he had just experienced. He could feel the apology hanging in the air, empty, hollow, meaningless. The words didn't change what had happened. They didn't erase the humiliation, the fear, the anger that had gripped him in that cell. It wasn't the first time Daniel had been treated like this. It wasn't the first time he had been judged based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. But this time, it had been different. This time, it had been so much worse. Because this time, he had done everything right. He had complied. He had remained calm. He had followed the rules. And yet none of that had mattered. None of it had protected him from the assumptions they had made about him the moment they saw him. Daniel's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, threatening to spill over. "It shouldn't matter who I am," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "It shouldn't matter if I'm a CEO or just another guy driving home from work. You didn't care about who I was. You cared about what I looked like." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between each other, but no one spoke. They couldn't. There was nothing they could say to justify what had happened. "Do you know how many times this has happened to me?" Daniel continued, his voice rising with each word. "How many times I've been stopped, questioned, treated like a criminal for no reason. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Reed shook his head, his eyes wide with fear and guilt. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Because for him, this was an anomaly, an embarrassing mistake that would probably be swept under the rug with a few apologies and some paperwork. But for Daniel, this was life. This was the reality he had lived with every day. And now it was all coming to the surface. "You're going to let me go," Daniel said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "That's supposed to make this better? You think this just goes away because you say you're sorry?" Reed opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't have an answer, because there was no answer. There was no way to make this right. Daniel could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, the anger, the frustration, the helplessness. But at the same time, there was something else, a sense of power. Not the kind of power that came from his career or his connections, but the power that came from knowing the truth. The power that came from standing up and saying, "No more." "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Daniel said finally, his voice calm, steady but filled with a quiet strength. "This isn't over." Reed's face drained of color. He nodded, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Of course," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. As Daniel walked out of the station, the cool night air hit him like a wave, washing over him and calming the storm that had been raging inside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest slowly begin to ease. He had won. Not just the battle, but the war. He had taken their assumptions, their prejudice, and turned it back on them. And now, as he stood outside the station, the stars shining faintly in the night sky above him, he knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had been through what he had just endured. And now, with his platform, with his voice, he could make sure that people heard their stories. He could make sure that no one else would have to sit in that cell, wondering if they would ever be seen for who they truly were. It didn't take long for the story to break. Within hours of Daniel's release, the news had spread like wildfire. Local reporters were the first to catch wind of it, but soon it was everywhere. Social media exploded with outrage, the hashtags trending within minutes. Number Justice for Daniel, number racial profiling, number end police bias. The video footage of Daniel's arrest, captured by a passerby who had filmed the entire thing, went viral almost instantly. In the footage, you could see it all. The flashing lights, the moment Daniel was pulled out of his car, handcuffed and led away. The confusion on his face, the fear in his eyes, and then the final blow. The revelation of his true identity. The internet was ablaze with comments, tweets, and posts, each one more furious than the last. The media latched onto the story, each outlet spinning its own version of the events. Some painted Daniel as a hero, a man who had fought back against systemic injustice. Others focused on the broader issue of racial profiling and the way the police had handled the situation. But through it all, one thing was clear. Daniel's story was no longer just about him. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry for change. For Daniel, the sudden onslaught of attention was overwhelming. He had spent his entire life building his reputation as a businessman, as a philanthropist, as someone who gave back to his community. But now he was being thrust into a role he hadn't asked for, a symbol of a much larger fight. And while he knew that this was a fight worth fighting, it didn't make the reality of it any easier. His phone rang nonstop, calls from reporters, from activists, from people he hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to talk to him, to hear his side of the story, to get his take on what had happened. And while part of him wanted to step into that spotlight, to use this moment to call attention to the injustice he had faced, another part of him wanted to retreat. He wanted to go back to his quiet life, his family, his work. But he knew that wasn't possible now. Not after everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" Lisa's voice broke through the silence, soft and filled with concern. Daniel opened his eyes, looking over at her. She was sitting next to him, her hand resting gently on his arm, her eyes filled with the same worry she had carried since the moment she had found out about his arrest. She had been strong for him, stronger than he had even realized. But now, in the quiet of their home, the weight of everything was starting to show. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his voice tired. It's a lot." Lisa nodded, her brow furrowed. "People are angry. They want justice. They want answers." Daniel sighed. "I know, and I want that too. But I don't know how to do this. I'm not an activist, Lisa. I'm just a guy who got pulled over." Lisa looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You're more than that, Daniel. You always have been. And now people are looking to you. They see what happened to you, and they see themselves. This is bigger than just you." Lisa was right. This was bigger than him. It had always been bigger than him. The story of his arrest was just one in a long line of stories. Stories of Black men and women who had been mistreated, profiled, and dehumanized by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Daniel was at the center of that conversation. The messages poured in, thousands of them. People from all walks of life, all races, all backgrounds, sharing their own encounters with racial profiling and police bias. Some were simple messages of support. "Stay strong, Daniel. We're with you." Others were heartbreaking. "This happened to my brother. He didn't make it home." Each story hit Daniel harder than the last. He had known, of course, that this was a widespread issue. He had read the headlines, watched the videos, and followed the stories of others who had faced the same injustice. But now it felt personal. Each message was a reminder that this wasn't just his fight, it was all of their fight. The protests started the next day. People gathered in front of the police station, holding signs and chanting for change. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore, it was about the system. The signs read, "No justice, no peace, stop racial profiling, Black Lives Matter." The crowd was filled with people of all races, all ages, all backgrounds. It was a movement, a call for justice that went beyond one man's experience. Daniel watched from a distance, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because he could see the power in the movement, the way people were coming together to demand change. But sadness because it shouldn't have taken this. It shouldn't have taken his arrest, his humiliation, for people to wake up and see what had been happening all along. The media picked up on the protests, their cameras capturing the crowd, the signs, the chants. Reporters interviewed activists, community leaders, and even some of the protesters themselves, all of them speaking out against the injustice that Daniel had faced. It was no longer just a local story, it was national news. But for Daniel, it was still personal. He wasn't just a headline or a hashtag. He was a man, a father, a husband, a son, who had been dehumanized by a system that saw him as a threat rather than as a person. And now, as the protests grew, as the voices grew louder, He knew that this was his moment to speak, to use his platform, his voice, to demand change. "I want to thank everyone who has shown me support," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never expected this. I never wanted this. But now that we're here, I have to say something. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. It's about every black man, every black woman, every person of color who has ever been treated as less than because of the way they look. This has to stop," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "We can't keep letting this happen. We can't keep letting people be judged by the color of their skin. It's time for change, real change, and it's going to take all of us to make that happen." As Daniel spoke, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice. This was about the future. In the weeks that followed Daniel's arrest, the movement only grew stronger. Protests continued across the city. Calls for accountability echoed in every corner, and the pressure on the police department intensified. What had started as one man's experience had become a rallying cry for something much bigger, a demand for justice, for reform, for an end to racial profiling and police bias. For Daniel, the days were long, filled with meetings, interviews, and phone calls. Activists reached out to him, leaders in the community rallied behind him, and even national figures took notice. He had never asked for this role, never wanted to be at the center of the storm. But now that he was here, he couldn't turn away. He knew that his voice could make a difference. And so he spoke. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Daniel said during one of the many interviews he gave. "It's about what happens to black men and women across this country every single day. What happened to me was a mistake, but it's part of a much bigger problem. A system that sees people of color as a threat, that treats them as less than human. That has to change." The public listened, and so did the police department. As the pressure mounted, the department was forced to confront the reality of what had happened. Internal investigations were launched, statements were made, and eventually the police chief held a press conference, his face somber as he addressed the media. "We deeply regret the incident involving Mr. Daniel Hargrove," the police chief said, his voice careful, measured. "An internal review is underway to ensure that this kind of incident does not happen again. We are committed to addressing the issues of racial bias within our department, and we will take the necessary steps to rebuild the trust of our community." The words were there, but Daniel knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Apologies were important, but they wouldn't change the system. Real change required action, and that's what he was determined to push for. Behind the scenes, Daniel began working with legal teams and activists to hold the police accountable, not just for his arrest, but for the systemic issues that had led to it. He filed a formal lawsuit against the department, not for the money, but for the principle. He knew that if real change was going to happen, the system needed to feel the consequences of its actions. The lawsuit became a symbol of something larger, and as it gained traction, it sparked conversations about police reform across the country. Other cities began looking at their own departments, asking hard questions about racial bias, accountability, and transparency. Daniel's case was becoming more than just a personal fight. It was becoming a catalyst for change. "Accountability is the first step," Daniel said during one of the strategy sessions. "But it's not the last. We need policy changes. We need to end racial profiling. We need to rebuild the trust between the police and the communities they're supposed to protect." And slowly, change began to happen. The police department made commitments to reform, launching new training programs aimed at addressing racial bias. Policies were updated, and a civilian oversight committee was established to ensure that the department remained accountable to the people it served. It wasn't enough to fix everything. Daniel knew that, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that, maybe, things could change. Hope that the next generation wouldn't have to go through what he had endured. Life slowly returned to normal for Daniel and his family. The lawsuit continued, the media attention faded, and the protests, though still ongoing, became less frequent. But the impact of what had happened lingered. Daniel knew that his life would never be the same, and in some ways he was grateful for that. He had been given a platform, a voice, and he intended to use it for good. But even as the fight continued, Daniel knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The system that had wrongfully arrested him was still in place, still affecting the lives of people who didn't have his resources, his connections, or his platform. And that's what kept him going. That's what fueled his determination to keep pushing for change. One case isn't going to fix everything, Daniel said during a speech he gave at a community event a few months later. But it's a start, and we have to start somewhere. We can't wait for the perfect moment or the perfect solution. We have to act now, and we have to act together. Change is possible, Daniel continued, his voice strong and clear. But it's going to take all of us. We have to hold the system accountable. We have to demand better. And we have to keep fighting. Because every step forward brings us closer to the world we want to live in. As Daniel stepped down from the stage, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice was far from over. But he knew now more than ever that change was possible. He had seen it, he had lived it, and he would keep fighting for it, because that was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with every voice raised, with every step taken, we move closer, closer to justice, closer to equality, closer to a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that is worth fighting for.